It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. The UK government is hosting talks on the war in Ukraine today. But is there any deal that Vladimir Putin and President Zelensky can agree on? Also,
risks to the global economy have increased and are firmly to the downside. While we are not projecting a global downturn, the risk it may happen this year have increased substantially.
The Chancellor's arrived in Washington to hear more bad news about the world economy. What will it mean for public services and the cost of living here? New figures show the number of unsafe bathing spots in England doubled last year. How can sewage discharges be stopped? The political row about women's spaces and trans rights is continuing.
I know what a woman is, and I always have. The people of this country know what a woman is. We didn't need the Supreme Court to tell us that, but this government did.
I have campaigned for decades on women's rights. I know more than most the importance of spaces for women. I fought for them, I delivered them, I ran them.
And the Prime Minister will be facing Kemi Badenoch at PMQs live at midday. Joining me, Labour MP Clive Lewis, Conservative MP David Reid, Liberal Democrat MP and Deputy Leader Daisy Cooper, and former Conservative Government Advisor Salma Shah. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Let's start with those talks that are going to be happening here in London about Russia and Ukraine and the potential for a peace or ceasefire. Let's take a look at some of the headlines. The Daily Telegraph. Trump to let Putin keep land seized from Ukraine. American and Ukrainian officials to meet in London to discuss a deal that gives Kyiv no clear US security guarantee. This headline in the Financial Times. Putin's offer to halt war at current front lines piles pressure on Ukraine. And finally, the BBC headline. Top US officials pull out of Russia-Ukraine ceasefire talks in London. Yes, reports that they're now downgraded because the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff have pulled out of these talks. How much of a snub that is, we can discuss with the panel. Starting with you, though, Clive. Are there any reasons to be hopeful for a peace deal?
Not particularly, and it depends on which peace deal you're talking about. Are you talking about the one being hosted by David Lammy, or are you talking about the peace talks being hosted by Donald Trump and President Putin, which are excluding Ukraine? Look, I think it feels very much, especially with the talk that Russia may be ceded, or they want to cede Crimea and other parts of land that they've won. It really does feel like the old Median dialogue. The strong do what they will and the weak would endure what they must. And that's not a world that I want to live in, Joe. History shows us what happens when we allow countries to take other countries by force. And it's not something I want to see. And I understand, I want to see peace in Ukraine. I think everyone does. But at what price? And also, what price 5, 10, 15 years down the line? If I was living in the Baltic states, I'd be very nervous if Russian aggression then enabled them to take Crimea and other lands in the east of Ukraine. Would the eye of Putin then turn on to the Baltic states? Would it turn to Finland? These are the questions that we have to ask ourselves, especially as you have a United States which is withdrawing from European defence. So I think these are all issues that have to be thought about and considered.
Have you any reasons to be hopeful? I mean, picking up on what Clive has said, certainly the reports today are saying that Donald Trump will allow Vladimir Putin to keep almost all of the territory he has seized from Ukraine under the terms of any potential peace deal. And the discussion is around pausing the war on the current front lines until a peace deal can be agreed. None of this officially has been put to President Zelensky, according to the Ukrainians. So are you hopeful?
So I've been really proud of how our country's acted across multiple governments now to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Ukrainians. I think the peace deal that's been put forward now, there are a number of points that I think will be fairly unpalatable to the Ukrainians. And that's probably why the US Secretary of State's Marco Rubio has pulled out from talks and then sort of led to our Foreign Secretary David Lammy pulling out. But this is a peace negotiation and it has started now. I want there to be peace. I want the killing to stop. But I think going to a few of the points that Clive raised, is that we are going through a fundamental shift now in how the world has worked since the end of World War II. And I think the message that some of the points in the peace negotiation come from, of ceding land, radically change how we view our world. And it goes back to that position of, if you invade a country and if you just stick it out, you'll be able to keep that land. And I think the message that sends to other places in the world, like China and Taiwan, I think we are going down an interesting route.
Right. I mean, listening to both Clive and David, they sound as if they are saying, don't cede land and territory to Russia and to Vladimir Putin. Do you think that'll be possible in order to get a peace deal?
I think it's absolutely outrageous that effectively Donald Trump and President Putin seem to be carving up Ukraine irrespective of what the Ukrainians want. I think that's outrageous that that's happening. Ukraine has to be front and centre of this. And there are a huge number of principles at stake here. First of all, fundamentally, is about the future of Ukraine, the Ukrainian people, and them having getting back their sovereign territory. That's obviously number one priority. But it's about European security as well. It's also about the message it sends to other countries and other potential aggressors around the world, that they can't just go invading other countries and stick it out and try and get other people's territory. And I hope very much that in Parliament we can continue to speak with one voice, and I hope very much that our Prime Minister speaks very clearly to sending a message to Donald Trump and President Putin that we will not stand for this.
Right. Do you think, Salma, that Marco Rubio pulling out and Steve Witkoff is a big snub? Does that send a rather firm message that the UK, perhaps, when it comes to these talks, isn't key?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if we had a closer relationship with the US and this administration, and we had the ability to influence them, this would not have happened. I do think, though, as much as we can all be united here about the fact that an aggressor should not succeed, this is the reality that we need to deal with. And the fact is that this war was always going to come to some kind of negotiated settlement, because there are only certain things that we are willing to do. Even the EU is not united, let alone us who sit outside of it, in how we should deal with Ukraine. The Germans are not nearly as punchy, if you like, as we are. And there are decisions that are going to have to be made, especially with a weakening NATO down the track, as to how much we actually want to commit to our own security and protection, which is the same thing that the Americans have been saying. So I think we have to accept that there are going to be debates about what that security looks like in the future.
Right. Do you think a closer relationship would have actually got Marco Rubio on the
I don't. I think the Trump administration will do what it wants. And I think, it's MAGA. It's America first. It isn't America first, and then also will take into account a close relationship with the United Kingdom. It's just rubbish. It's America first. And if America first treads over the United Kingdom and its interest, it will do that. What I wanted to make the point was, if the US is withdrawing, then one of the things I think we do need to do in Europe is to also consider the part that we played in where we now are. Because so the point I want to talk about is the fact that
allowing Crimea.
Well, Russia's security concerns. Russia is on our border. It isn't going to go anywhere. Russia's security concerns are a legitimate issue. Anyone that knows the last kind of 100, 150 years of history will know that that is a real issue. And it is no more controversial to say that the way the West behaved after the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the material conditions that led to Putin and the aggression that he has conducted. It's no more controversial than saying the material conditions created by the Versailles Treaty allowed the conditions. No. Let me finish my point.
Hindsight is a wonderful thing.
It is a wonderful thing, but the material conditions of the Versailles Treaty enabled the material conditions for Hitler and his aggression. They were both part of the same. So what I'm saying is, Russia is going to be a part of our security world for the foreseeable future, as long as Russia is there.
But you're comparing the end of the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles with Germany with the collapsing of the Soviet Union.
I'm saying that the material conditions of how different countries behaved and the decisions they've taken can lead to conditions which therefore mean that Putin has now come about.
Sorry,
my point here is, we are going to have to take into account, if America is withdrawing from West, then we're going to have to take into account Russia's security concerns. Now, that doesn't mean that Russia has a right to invade other countries. Clearly, it doesn't. Russia is our neighbour, and that will mean that we will have to find...
Go on. I'll let the others have a brief comment.
So what do you see as Russia's security concerns at this point in time?
Look at the last 100 years of history.
What particularly?
Think about the
sovereign territory in the Crimea that
the reality is, if the US are not going to be around as much as they are, then we're going to have to come to a relationship with Russia that works.
So
it's as simple as that.
All right.
Or
on that point,
we'll be in a permanent war.
So on that point, it's very important to talk about
years.
history. Very important to talk about history and to learn from it. But it's important now to talk about what we're doing as a country. So I sat in the chamber yesterday with the Defence Secretary, John Healey, and we talked about the coalition of the willing. Now, there are a number of questions that are still unanswered. So the Defence Secretary has talked about safer seas, safer skies, putting British boots on the ground in Ukraine. Now, there are deep and fundamental questions around Article 5, what NATO means, and I think that's what we need to be talking about as a country.
Right. Closer relationship with Europe, then, would that help?
Absolutely, it would. I mean, we're talking about a security coalition of the willing. I think there also needs to be an economic coalition of the willing as well, so that the UK can work with its European and Commonwealth allies to try and isolate Donald Trump and his damaging trade war.
All right, well, we're going to...
What's so sad from that is that we're potentially ceding fishing rights to be able to buy into the 150 billion
Well,
euro.
all right, let's just park that there. Let's talk more broadly about the economy, because the global economy is set to be front and centre again today as Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, arrives in Washington for the summit, the International Monetary Fund Summit. She'll spend a few days there, and that is after the IMF cut the global forecast yesterday. Here is the BBC headline: US growth forecast to be hit hardest from Trump tariffs. So says the IMF. Let's listen to their chief economist.
The landscape has changed since our last World Economic Outlook update in January. We're entering a new era as the global economic system that has operated for the last 80 years is being reset.
And the IMF has also warned that Britain's economy will be hit by the global trade war, and inflation is set to climb. It cut the UK growth forecast by a third. Let's talk to the BBC's Deputy Economics Editor, Darshini David. Hello to you, Darshini. How much trouble is the global economy in?
Well, Jo, we heard it there from the IMF, didn't we? A new era, and that economist went on to say, in which the global economy will be severely tested. It sounded like words out of Star Wars, incidentally, another issue which was to do about trade wars. But when you look at the actual numbers, the IMF isn't predicting either a global or even a US recession. Having said that, the US economy got the biggest downgrade of all for the outlook for growth. And when you look at what the IMF is actually saying under the covers, they're saying that, you know, basically the risk of recession in the US, the risk of recession around the globe has risen substantially in the last 6 months. And away from the spreadsheets, back in the real world, a sentiment of UK businesses, a survey rather of UK business sentiment has been coming out in the last hour or so. That has shown a severe drop as those tariffs become a reality. So that just gives you a little idea of the reality that businesses around the world and therefore economies are grappling with, and why this is quite a tense time, to put it that way.
Difficult decisions for the Chancellor ahead when it comes to spending and taxation?
Indeed, because back in the UK, as you say, the IMF lowered its forecast, a reminder of some of the challenges facing the Chancellor, and part of that revision was to do with the trade war and tariffs. Part of it was to do with domestic factors. And when you look at the figures that have come out on the public finances this morning, you can see that even before the tariffs took hold, we were not in the best shape. If you look at the deficit for the last year, almost £15 billion more in the last financial year than the official forecasters thought just a month ago. So that goes to show the challenges the Chancellor faces. We are spending more on items such as pay in the public sector, and also on interest payments on existing debt. So you can see why she's so nervous about growth perhaps taking another knock, and why it is that she's trying to persuade us she's there in the nation's interest to have these talks with her opposite number in the US. What she'll get, though, is a different question altogether.
Well, indeed, this trade deal that she is no doubt seeking with the US, what might it look like, Darshini?
Well, Jo, when we've talked about this before in the first Trump administration years, it was about eliminating tariffs. Now it's about damage limitation, about making sure that tariffs don't go any higher, and perhaps trying to reduce some of the more extreme ones, like the ones, for example, on the auto industry, and make sure the drugs industry doesn't face tariffs. But what will the UK have to give up in return? That is the big question. The US likes to think at the moment that it's got holding all the cards in this, that the time is ticking away. So there are many people saying, look, you know, if the UK is going to get anything at all, there's going to be some compromise. We know that food standards is not on the table, but there's all sorts of other tariffs they can tinker with. And, for example, an agreement on artificial intelligence is hoped for as well. But the big question is, where is going to the give going to be for the UK, and what could that do to our prospects?
Darshini, David, thank you very much. Well, let's pick up on what might be the compromise, Clive. Should the UK compromise, food standards perhaps on one side, and I'll ask you whether you trust and are reassured by the fact that the government has stated that, but should the UK negotiate and compromise in order to get that 25% tariff put on steel and cars lowered?
Well, there's no guarantee that would happen. And my personal view is that by taking the position we have in terms of pivoting closer to Europe and kind of ruling out that, well, if not ruling it out, making it more difficult for ourselves. You know, it's our biggest trading partner, the EU. It's right on our doorstep. Culturally, we're far more aligned with it. Well, I am. I can't speak for everyone on the panel, but culturally, I'm far more aligned to Europe than the US, apart from language. And I would say that that is where we should be placing most of our efforts in terms of securing a trade deal that would be better for the UK economy. Look, the Trump regime is a proto-fascist regime. And look at what it's done on Ukraine. Look at what it's doing domestically. You know, look, democracy is many things. But what I would say is the version of democracy that the Trump administration is moving to is a darker one, a more dystopian one, and it's not one that I want to see the UK moving towards.
Right.
And I think, therefore...
So you're very unhappy with how Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, Labour Prime Minister, has carried out...
Not unhappy. Look, I understand the reality, which is that we trade with the United States and we want to maintain that trade. But when you've got a trading partner that is insisting on tariffs, it's causing international economic chaos, then you have to question, you know, which eggs you want to put your basket into. And I would say you want to start moving away from the US.
Well, David, do you agree?
E
Move away from the US and embrace the EU again.
So I think just to touch on Darshini's report there, we're in this position where we're having to react very quickly because of domestic factors. So the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has spent the last year and a half talking down the British economy, and that has real world effects. So we've seen from the IMF now that domestic factors are a significant part of why we're in this position, of why our growth has been downgraded to 1.1% and 1.1%
beforehand. Surely they had a small part to play.
We're talking about the IMF's report right now. Is that the Labour government have made decisions, and those decisions have harmed the UK.
So whether that be putting in year zero, and you know.
Let me finish. So by putting extra strain on businesses, the actual people that produce, by attacking our farmers, that has hit our country.
And tariffs, have they not hit the economy?
Of course, but we're in a position now where we're having to move quickly because our domestic economy is not in a good position. The Chancellor has hemmed herself in with these fiscal rules at a time of international volatility, and I should imagine that she's probably going to have to break them.
Right. Do you accept that? Has the Chancellor damaged the economy?
Has she damaged the economy? No, but the economy itself is damaging.
The economy itself is damaging. The
economy itself is damaging us. The economy that we've inherited, the structure of the economy, how it's working. And we talk about fiscal rules. I mean, let's talk about very quickly, if I can, on fiscal rules. You know, the world is changing. The global economy is changing. And if you're gonna, you know, think about juggling. You're juggling with a pair of handcuffs on, you know, and there's people throwing multiple balls at you from different directions. Maybe you should take the handcuffs off.
All right, so you think that the Chancellor should borrow even more? Because the figures that have come out and said that borrowing is even higher than expected.
But let me challenge you on that. Let me challenge you on that,
Joe. Those are the figures.
No, but listen, these are arbitrary figures on borrowing, okay? That you're picking out. This is the economic orthodoxy. Throughout history, about the idea that there are limits and caps that must be set on borrowing. The only people that benefit that aren't the disabled, aren't pensioners. On winter fuel payments, it's the City of London, it's equity
Clive,
traders.
The Chancellor doesn't agree with you, the Labour Chancellor, on that. I mean, there is a view that says perhaps borrowing is the way forward, not more taxation, not more cuts to spending. But there is a potential problem, and that's how the markets respond. And rightly or wrongly.
But the reality is we are laden with debt. Most of our counterparts are laden with debt as well, because there was a hell of a lot of borrowing that happened during the pandemic in order to keep the economy going, because it was suppressed as a consequence of lockdowns. And, you know, people will have their own views as to whether that was right or wrong, but that is a reality. Well, I mean, I agreed with the lockdowns at the time. I think there might be a way to consider, in the fullness of time, what we actually need to do and how we should react to pandemics.
Debt was justified
I
in
think
those
that
circumstances.
But we have the question that the debt exists. That's just a fact. Okay?
It's a fact, no, but it was a decision that was taken.
Which the opposition supported.
Because people are.
So would you not agree with that?
I would agree with that, but it was a decision that was taken to increase the debt for a purpose of looking after the public.
I was actually going to make a point. So can you not interrupt
Sorry.
me? And then Daisy wants to make a point as well. So if you allow us, that would be really helpful. So the reality is that we have this debt. So if you want to talk about borrowing, because the question was, do we borrow more? Where the interest rates are at the moment means that it would be prohibitive. We are already servicing a lot of debt at a very high rate. So most UK taxpayers are not going to want their hard-earned tax money to go to pay on servicing debt. They want it into public services. So the question is going to have to be taxation, which is already hit because of the receipts of wealth creators leaving, or cutting public services.
Right, but Clive's point, I suppose, is that during the pandemic, it was deemed an emergency, which it was, and so there was £400 billion worth of borrowing to pay people's wages. Are we in a different kind of emergency? Borrowing has gone up again in the last year because of pay and benefits going up. Was that necessary too?
I think we're in a different situation right now. We are facing a perfect storm. We've got this terrible economic inheritance from the Conservative Party. We've got the growth-crushing budget from Labour, and we now have a trade war with these tariffs coming from Donald Trump. So we've got a perfect storm facing our economy. I think it's very difficult, as Salma says, given that our debt to GDP ratio is about 100% now. It's very, very difficult for the government to borrow even more, and they're sort of maxing that out. But there are other options on the table, and what we Liberal Democrats have said is, first of all, the government should be looking to raise taxes on big corporations that are making billions of pounds in profit, who can afford to pay a little bit more to get our public service back on their feet. And we've got to get growth back into the economy, and you do that by replacing business rates and by renegotiating our deal with the EU so we can trade more freely and generate more growth for British businesses.
Would you agree with that? It is time to tax big corporations, big banks.
It's easy to throw out big statements, but at the end of the last government, after a really expensive pandemic, Rishi Sunak brought inflation down to the target of 2%.
If you want to defend the mini-budget, a cost of living crisis, I mean, really, come on.
Let me speak.
So removed
and growth
reality.
is going in the right direction. Now, what we're seeing at the moment, and this is exactly what we're talking about right here from the IMF, is that domestic decisions that the Chancellor has made have made inflation go up.
I'm not defending the Labour government, but
and growth go down.
You cannot defend the Conservative Party's record with a cost of living crisis and a mini budget that threw inflation through the roof, where mortgage holders are still feeling the effect of that alongside struggling families.
Daisy,
so I'm not defending the Labour government, but I'm certainly not defending
giving
yours
facts
either.
here. If you're not happy with those facts,
I think the only thing there is, and that's fair enough. You're not here to defend the Labour government. You want to talk about Lib Dem policy. But if you think about where growth is at the moment and the fact that UK PLC is really struggling in terms of being able to retain and grow its base, hitting them again with corporation tax after you've just wiped them out, especially big employers, with national insurance and the change in thresholds, would actually slow the economy down even more. So what you're proposing is actually going to exacerbate the issue.
Right, well, as a Labour, did you want to defend the Labour government, Clive?
Completely different tax. Digital services tax and the big tech companies, tax and the big gaming companies.
But that exists. Only a trade agreement could potentially put that at risk. Digital services tax is something that Rishi Sunak's government
and you could put it up.
I haven't spoken for about 15 seconds.
It's one of the lowest taxes in Europe. It's one of the lowest VSTs.
I was just going to say on the debt to GDP ratio, which I think is a really important issue here. The reason I find that really interesting is we're the only country in the world, the only country with a central bank in the Western world where we pay back the losses of the central bank. And I think it's about £16 billion a month for that. Now, when you take that off, like the US doesn't do that, Japan doesn't do that, the EU central bank doesn't do that.
Yeah, but the US is a reserve currency. It's slightly different.
Okay, and the US, but you can look at Japan, you can look at other countries as well. No other G20 country does this to their central bank. When you look at that, debt to GDP ratio, when you take that off, comes down to around about German levels, around about 70%. So my point here is the rules are what they are, and we can make them differently if we want to. And we can define what the economy is, and we can define how it works. But we choose to stick with this orthodoxy, which is killing us, killing our constituents, hurting the public, and leading to an economy that isn't working for the people it should be, which is the the British public.
Right. Do you think the rules should be reconsidered? And is it time that Kemi Badenoch spoke even more about what went on during certainly the last 5 years of Conservative governments that led to Liz Truss and the mini-budget and soaring inflation?
So I think going back to that main point, the world is changing very quickly now. We've gone through a pandemic. We've gone through another of sort of economic shifts from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There has been a number of things that have happened, and we've had to steady the ship. Now, I won't sit here and try and defend the mini-budget that came out, but going back to that central point that Rishi Sunak's government was able to bring inflation down to where it needs to be and growth was going in the right direction. He warned that this would happen with Rachel Reeve's plans, and it's domestic decisions that the Chancellor has made that have put us in this position now.
Right. Just very briefly, do you think the UK can sweet-talk its way out of some of the tariffs?
I think it's going to be incredibly difficult. I mean, I worked in the Business and Trade Department. We worked on what was the TTIP negotiation then, which was the EU transatlantic partnership with the US. And there was always the view that if we had Brexited, which was the discussion at the time, it was before Brexit actually happened, that we would be, as Obama said, in the back of the queue. And I think that the US position has not changed in the way that it treats the UK or thinks about the UK, because we're a minnow in comparison to the other trading blocs that it wants to prioritise.
Let's talk about our water quality, because there is plenty of discussion around sewage in our rivers, particularly. Let's take a look at this headline in The Independent. Shocking state of Britain's waters revealed as bathing spots with potentially deadly bacteria double. Now, according to new data from the Environment Agency, 37 of England's 451 protected bathing spots are now rated as poor, which is the lowest category, due to unsafe levels of potentially deadly bacteria caused by sewage spills. Clive, does that come as a shock to you?
No, not really. Given that 3.6 million hours of sewage discharged into our water in the last couple of years, not at all. And you can look at this in two ways. You can either see this as a regulatory failure, which my government does, or you can see our privatised water system as an outlier. I think there are only a handful of countries that have privatised water systems. Not even the US has gone down this route. I think the other main country it happened under was Pinochet's Chile. So water shouldn't be privatised. Privatisation is the problem. 60 billion racked up in debt, 72 billion pounds in dividends. We had 100 reservoirs built before privatisation. Since privatisation, they've sold 25 of them off and haven't built a single one. They've started now, but before then, not a single one. This is a Ponzi scheme. It's not fit for purpose, and it should be brought back into public ownership. Not necessarily nationalisation, but some kind of mutualisation. I would prefer, but let's have the public have a say on this.
Right. What do you say about the failed ideology of privatisation that the Tories embraced?
So this has been an issue that I've been focusing on heavily now. I've come from a coastal constituency. I've not been happy with where water's been for a number of years. It's happened over decades. It hasn't just come up on us. I sat on the Water Special Measures Bill. We need to put a far stronger regulatory framework around these monopolies so that they are doing what the public wants them to do, because customers don't have elsewhere to go. They can't just change their water company. They have to move house. So I think just touching on one of the points that Clive raised, if water was to be nationalised or brought back into some type of public ownership, when we're talking about all the different pressures that our economy currently has, whether that be the need to increase defence spending, an ageing population, these are all really expensive things, then where would water be in this?
Right. Well, before I get that answer from you, what do you think needs to be done, Daisy? Do you agree with Clive it should come back into public ownership?
Well, look, Scotland's water is nationalised, Wales's water is non-profit and it's privatised in England, and all three countries have got problems with sewage dumping. So there's a problem right across the board. So I don't think that... I think ownership is part of the problem, but it's not the only problem. So what we have said as a party is we would like to see these water companies turned into public benefit companies. That means they'd be required in law to put environmental principles over profit. We also want to see some of the fantastic volunteers and water wardens that exist right across the country have places on the boards of those water companies as well. We think Ofwat, the regulator, is not fit for purpose. They have failed. They've been investigating for several years now and haven't issued a single fine, so they should be scrapped and replaced with a regulator with teeth. And we need to put an absolute ban on bonuses until this sewage dumping has stopped.
Right. What's wrong with public ownership of our water?
I think the major problem at the moment, as I understand it, is that obviously we have huge amounts of debt in this country and we simply can't afford to be bailing out the water companies.
Well,
and so a better way of doing it would be to change the model so that you keep them as private companies, but they're required in law to put their environmental principles first. And that hits the sweet spot of making sure that you don't have to nationalise and spend billions of pounds of taxpayers' money doing that, but you do get the public benefit.
And the cost, the price tag is £100 billion, according to the Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, and I suppose he should know. How would the government fund that?
That's a figure that's been debunked already. But
how much do you think it would cost?
Well, it's for Parliament to decide. When you do an audit of the private water companies, how much you do an audit of the private water companies, how much they've paid out in inflated bonuses and executive pay, how much they've taken out in dividend payments, how much they've borrowed against assets.
And how
Take
much
that
they've
into
invested?
account, and then Parliament, how much they've invested, definitely. And then Parliament can make a decision on what they get paid. Simple as that. We've done it before in the past, we can do it again. So the 100 billion figure is plucked out of the air, it's not realistic. But in terms of raising the money, well, where do you think most of the investment that's coming from now? If you've taken £72 billion in dividends, you've racked up £60 billion in debt, and that tells me that it's our bills that pay for the investment.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. But if private water companies have raised £60 billion against the assets of water, we could do that ourselves. We could issue bonds at a regional level. You could issue bonds against the asset, That would make perfect sense.
David is looking. Well, David's looking sceptical.
I don't understand any of those proposals in the nicest possible way. I think, for me, the pragmatic approach now is to put a really strong regulatory framework around water companies. So I think the act that's gone through now,
everyone agrees that the regulator
is the first step towards that, and there is cross-party consensus. So about 90% of the bill for water was created in the last government.
It's quite a weak bill, though.
We pushed
quite a weak bill.
This is why I've just said it's the first step. Okay, we all want this to improve.
Oh, for sure.
We all want this to improve. We understand the scale of the problem. We pushed for monitoring in the last Parliament. We understand the scale of the problem. Now we need to make sure.
Well, we do understand it now for monitoring. Can I just ask David, and I'll come back to the difficulty or the proposals that David says won't work or didn't understand in the way you sort of express them. In terms of privatisation, do you accept privatising water in this country has failed?
I think we have taken our collective eye off the ball over the last 35 years, and we haven't put the legal structures around these monopolistic companies so that they act in accordance with how customers.
So privatisation of water has failed?
So I think a lot more needs to be done in order to make sure that people have confidence in their water system. And the clearest way forwards now is not at nationalisation, is making sure that these private water companies behave properly for their customers.
Right, so you can make privatisation. Well, I'll come back to you on the sort of proposals themselves, but I think it's £123 per household in terms of bills going up from this month to help the clean-up, fund the clean-up. Is it fair that consumers pay that?
No, it's not fair. And I actually think in and amongst all the answers from the politicians, there's probably somewhere that you could align and work out, the way forward. But you can't work out the way forward until you do have a retrospective look at the way that this has gone down. Privatisation and the principles that came forward in the Act in the 90s basically have been flouted. And I think Daisy has a very legitimate point about whether Ofwat took its eye off the ball, because if you look at the statutory underpinning of what they're supposed to look at, everything that we've spoken about already exists in the regulatory and legal framework. So where has the failure actually occurred? And I think that probably requires investigation. In order to look at how potentially you fund it, and I don't think nationalisation is the answer because of the costs involved, I think we have to look back at those people who did take the dividends out and understand whether that was appropriate and whether they did, and whether the boards of these companies responded to their fiduciary duties in order to secure those assets.
Right, but what sort of redress could you get, even if you concluded?
This is something that maybe a strengthened water bill could look at if you were looking at redress and clawing back some of that money, because I think that actually this is really disgraceful. And I don't think that privatisation is solely culpable when there has been processes that have not worked in this situation.
All I would say is we tabled, I think, we Liberal Democrats tabled 44 amendments to strengthen Labour's water bill. We welcome the fact that they're bringing they brought the water bill forward, but it does need to be strengthened significantly, including to put stronger legal powers in place to deter future sewage dumping, as well as to take action on those that have been responsible for it.
Right. I mean, Clive, none of the others seem to think that your plans, one way or another, will work.
So just on the difficulty of understanding. You understand borrowing against a mortgage, your property and asset.
Yes,
yeah, you do get that.
Therefore
you borrow.
They don't marry up with reality.
So no,
it's going to cost.
They do,
it's just
because we've done it
cost too
before.
much.
It's basically a bond that you give a set return on, backed against the asset of the actual water infrastructure. It's not difficult to.
Who's going to buy that
pension
bond?
companies would lap it up.
Yes,
no,
because they all.
Well, where do you think the £60 billion came from when they borrowed against the assets?
Well,
so anyway, but we can just move on from that very quickly. I think the issue here, the issue here isn't. It's about what we decide to do and what we choose to do. We can run our water in a different way. Other countries have shown the way forwards. This is an issue that is increasingly of concern because of the cost of living crisis, where private water companies are price gouging our constituents, okay? And on top of that, we know that there's a climate crisis where we're going to, but where we know the National Audit Office has already said that by 2035, 2040, we could be running out of water in this country. So this is a national security issue. And at the moment, we have private equity running our water in its own interests. We now need to change that and make sure that water is run in the interest of the public. And the best way to secure that is to give a public a say over how water is run and what its priorities for investment are.
All right. Would you be averse to the public having a say on how water is run?
I think so. The bill that we put forward through Parliament now gives customers a voice in that process. I think we've seen a lot of community scientists that have brought these problems to the fore, and I think we need to be listening a lot more.
All right, you can. Oh, yeah, go on very quickly.
There's a huge amount more that individuals could do. For example, there's people doing independent monitoring of the water, and that data isn't even used by the Environment Agency. So I think making sure that our river wardens can provide that independent monitoring, that information is used by the Environment Agency, giving them a role on the board of water companies, I think is a much stronger way to get them involved in the governance of water companies from the get-go. And
you can now listen to Politics live on the live news stream on BBC Sounds. You can see here, just go to the live dial at the top of the BBC Sounds homepage and tap on live news. Well, PMQs is coming up in just under 10 minutes' time. And yesterday evening in the Chamber, the Commons, the Minister for Women and Equalities delivered a statement on the Supreme Court ruling that biological sex defines a woman as seen through the Equality Act. Let's have a look at her exchange with Kemi Badenoch.
Why has it been such a battle? Because something as simple as biological reality became politicised and corrupted by activists pushing this ideology as foolish politicians cheered.
She held the post of Minister for Women and Equalities for 2 years and did precisely nothing, provided no clarity in the law and nothing to improve the lives of women, which got materially worse on her watch.
Bridget Phillipson there. The Prime Minister's spokesperson said yesterday and confirmed that Sir Keir Starmer doesn't believe a transgender woman is a woman. Clive, what do you make of the government's response to the Supreme Court ruling?
I think we'll see what's going to happen. All I know is that my view hasn't changed. My view is that trans men and women should be treated as human beings and treated with respect. That hasn't changed at all. Right. So,
but in terms of the eyes of the law, you do still believe that a trans woman is a woman and a trans man is a man.
What happened in the law, in terms of the interpretation, was a very rational application of the law as it stood about boards of women, public boards in Scotland. Now, lots of other people are jumping on the bandwagon to say that it's going to change this and change that. It doesn't have to. At the end of the day, courts interpret laws that we decide and pass. It's up to us to make laws which include people. Now, there are a small group of people out there who want to see trans people victimised. I would say the vast majority of people don't, but there's a small group of people out there, of extremists, that want to see trans people other them and victimise them.
Who?
The far right. If you look at people like J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, others like that on the right of politics, they're using them as a wedge issue to channel hate. And frankly, the vast majority of people in this country don't want that. And it's about protecting the rights of all human beings to live a life as they see fit, without discrimination and fear for their existence and their identity. Right. Well, that's the kind of world I would like to live in.
Right. But what do you make of Keir Starmer saying that a woman is defined by their ideology? Not by their ideology, by their biology, I should say. A biological woman defined through the Equality Act. He said in 2022...
I'm not responsible for what the Prime Minister says and does and changed his mind on. I'm not. That's up to him and up to Number 10. Well, I'm not. I can't be.
No.
Keir Starmer's
But do you agree with
Keir
him?
Starmer's an independent individual that can have his mind. No, I don't, because my view hasn't changed since last week. My view is the same.
Right,
So, you know,
even though the Supreme Court has ruled as such.
The Supreme Court has ruled on a case in Scotland about public boards. But it has.
All right.
But the court interprets the law. It's for us as legislators to change the law as we see fit.
David?
So I just think that the situation is extremely sad. That the Prime Minister has had to wait around for the Supreme Court, and I have complete respect for the Supreme Court, but wait for that judgment to come out for his view then to change. He is a political leader. He's the head of our leader of our country. He should be in a position where he can actually help guide this narrative. Now, Kemi has been really strong on this for a number of years, and I'm glad to see that it's come to fruition now. Now, there are a small group of people in this country that don't feel comfortable with their bodies, and I'm glad that we have a medical service and the support available to help those people. But we need clarity on this. I think just to finalise one point, what I'm really sad about throughout this whole process is that we've allowed this to become a really complicated discussion amongst adults, but we've also allowed this to seep into schools. And for young people now, where we'd have all learnt at a primary age what a man and a woman is in a biological scientific sense, we've allowed that water to become extremely muddied, and we've confused an entire generation. And I think Bridget Phillipson and the Department for Education needs to do a lot of work now to right that.
All right, Daisy?
Look, the Supreme Court gave quite a sort of narrow finding, and we respect the decision of the Supreme Court, but they decided what the definition of sex was in the Equality Act.
Do you agree with it?
Well, it's what the court has decided, so yes, on that, of course. But there's a separate issue where they haven't provided clarity, and that is how the Equality Act and the Gender Recognition Act interplay with each other. And that is the question that hasn't been settled. So one issue has been settled by the Supreme Court, another issue has not been settled. And that's why we think the government needs to bring forward guidance to provide that clarification about how those two pieces of legislation speak to each other so that individuals and service providers understand who has which rights and how to uphold and defend those rights as well.
But do you think Downing Street was correct in issuing that statement to say that the Prime Minister believes a woman is a biological woman, by biological sex?
But it's entirely up to Keir Starmer and Number 10 to say whatever they want to say.
Yes, but what do you think? Do you agree with it? Was it right for them to do that?
What I think is that the government should be providing further clarification about how these two pieces of legislation interact with each other. For 20 years now, trans people have had their rights defended in law, and it now seems as though this new interpretation of the law may change some of that. That's provided a huge amount of uncertainty and distress to a very small number of people who now don't know how they can access public services or public spaces. So what we really need to do is take the sting out of the debate, take the stigma out of the debate, take the heat out of the debate, and look at this from a human rights point of view and say the Supreme Court has provided clarification on this point.
Yes.
We still don't have clarification on this other point. That's why the government has got to bring forward that guidance.
So the Liberal Democrat view is now in agreement with Keir Starmer that a woman is a woman defined by her biology. I keep wanting to say ideology for some reason, biology.
But we accept what the Supreme Court is saying. We accept the Supreme Court ruling on the definition of sex in the Equality Act. But that doesn't solve the other problem that we still have, which how these two pieces of legislation work together to make sure that nobody suffers from discrimination. That's where we need some further clarification.
What did you make of Kemi Badenoch, Salma, standing up at the dispatch box? It's unusual for the leader of the opposition to respond in a debate in which the Education Secretary and, yes, admittedly, the Minister for Equalities and Women, to step up into this debate and respond.
Well, this has been part of her sort of a feature of her leadership, if you like. She's always talked about this. She's always been very much a part of that movement that is about, I mean, some people call it gender critical, but, the idea that biological sex is a fact. So she wants to take ownership of it. So I do see that this is her sort of, cementing her position, having seen this as a personal victory in some ways.
Right. Do you think there is any possibility that the Equality Act itself may be changed?
I think it might be more specification put into it. That could be done through secondary legislation. That's possible in terms of what was being discussed just now, which is more clarity. But that's always possible. And I think that's the point that Daisy was making. I just on this issue of the binary nature of sex. I mean, I was doing some reading on this, and You know, the 1.7% of the global population are defined as intersex. So that's people with hormonal differences, maybe XYY chromosomes, maybe hermaphrodites. Now, 1.7% isn't a statistical anomaly. They're not freaks. That's actually the same percentage of people that are ginger, for example. And if you're going to call ginger people freaks, then don't stand next to Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, because I'd like to see what happens. So 1.7%, they're protected under the UN as a protected characteristic, as a protected group of people. 1.7% of people who have characteristics for both men and women is a very interesting, and so this whole notion about are you a man, are you a woman? Biologically speaking, there's a whole category of the global population that falls somewhere in between.
Okay,
so,
sure, but what are the policy decisions and outcomes that flow from this decision, as Daisy was actually saying, to both of you? I mean, arguably, the Equality Act now, with this Supreme Court ruling, says that trans women cannot take part in sports. That would be one interpretation.
So, and the point I was trying to make on that was that actually this whole issue about are women women, actually, technically speaking, it's like asking the question, would you push the nuclear button if you become the Prime Minister? It's one of those questions which is trying to elicit another answer. And the point here, I think, and the court was very clear, is that trans men and women still deserve protection, rights, and to be respected. And it's for us as politicians to then decide how that works.
Well, how do you think it should work?
Do I think that a trans woman should be able to take part in a women's darts competition?
Yeah.
And I'm kind of thinking to myself,
but in Olympic sports, for example.
But a trans woman who's gone through puberty, who then wants to play women's rugby, well, then there's a difference. But it's not beyond the ken of government, beyond the ken of regulators to be able to say, on this issue, we're going to do that, on this issue, that. This doesn't just have to be so politically explosive.
Well, what would the policy outcome be for the Conservatives? What should Kemi Badenoch be saying about these sorts of decisions?
So I think Kemi was very, very clear in her statement yesterday, and going back to that point that she's led the vanguard on this for a number of years.
Sure.
So it'll be for Keir Starmer and for the Labour government now to take those interpretations and those findings from...
Let's go to PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, the entire House will join me in paying tribute to His Holiness Pope Francis, an extraordinary man. His lifelong work on fairness will leave a lasting legacy. And people of all backgrounds and beliefs were inspired by his humility and his compassion. And I think the outpouring of grief and love that we've seen in the last 2 days or so shows the respect and admiration that we've held in around the world. Mr. Speaker, I will attend his funeral on Saturday and pay tribute to his courage and to his leadership. May His Holiness rest in peace. Mr. Speaker, may I also wish everyone in England a very happy St. George's Day. There is a lot to celebrate: our history, our values and our culture. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Steve Darling. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I also wish the Chamber a happy St. George's Day. After a cost of living crisis overseen by the previous chaotic Conservative government, many in the tourist industry in Torbay believed that they had weathered the storm, as they had believed in Devon and Cornwall. However, with the government's NIC hikes and effective jobs tax, many in the tourist industry in Torbay fear that this could be the last nail in the coffin of some of those businesses. So in light of this summer, will the Prime Minister give me the pleasure of showing him round Paynton Zoo and seeing this outstanding, amazing tourism attraction in Torbay, one of many across the west of England who are sadly being massively impacted by this jobs tax?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's very... Well, look, may I start by wishing Jenny, his guide dog, a very happy birthday, I think, for yesterday. 6 years old, although she doesn't look particularly interested in my answer, I have to say. Mr. Speaker. Look, I do recognise the importance of tourism to his beautiful constituency. I've been there many times, worked there for a short time, and driving growth and creating jobs. We've announced a new Visitor Economy Advisory Council, which will work with business to deliver a new strategy focused on supporting growth and the tourism industry. Visit Britain has also launched a new international marketing campaign to showcase Britain's incredible heritage, culture and landscapes, and I know the Minister of Tourism will be happy to keep him updated.
Charlotte Littlewood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Criminal Injuries Compensation Scheme hasn't been uprated with inflation since 2012, meaning compensation for victims of violent crime, including rape and child abuse, is worth less than half what it was then in real terms. The consultation response published before Easter said there wasn't the money to look at changing the scope, tariffs or time limits, despite expert advice and the recommendations of the ICSA review. So will the Prime Minister commit to properly funding the Ministry of Justice to do this vital reform work so victims and their needs can become a priority instead of an afterthought?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable friend knows my personal commitment to delivering justice for victims of crime who've been completely failed over the last 14 years. We are improving access to compensation through better online systems and equipping staff with the skills they need to better support victims. We are, of course, also consulting on a revised Victims Code that will increase the powers of the Victims Commissioner to ensure more accountability, and I'm happy to ensure that she meets the relevant minister to discuss those issues.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, can I also wish everyone a happy St. George's Day? And can I also associate myself with the remarks about the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis on Easter Monday? Being married to a Catholic, I know the profound loss for millions in Britain and across the world. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister now accept that when he said that it was the law that trans women were women, he was wrong?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I welcome the Supreme Court ruling on this issue. It brings clarity and it will give confidence to women and, of course, to service providers. The Equality and Human Rights Commission will now issue updated guidance, and it's important that that happens and that all service providers then act accordingly. This government's approach and my approach has been as follows: to support and implement the Supreme Court ruling, and we will; to continue to protect single-sex spaces based on biological sex, and we will; but also to ensure that trans people are treated with respect, and we will; and to ensure that everybody is given dignity in their everyday lives. I do think this is the time now to lower the temperature, to move forward and to conduct this debate with the care and compassion that it deserves. And I think that should unite the whole House.
Mr. Speaker, he can't bring himself to admit that he was wrong. That was the question. But he spoke about respect and dignity and compassion and lowering the temperature. So will he now apologise to the member for Canterbury, the very brave member for Canterbury, for hounding her out of the Labour Party simply for telling the truth?
Mr. Speaker, I've always approached this on the basis that we should treat everyone with dignity and respect, whatever their different views, and I'll continue to do so. And I'll tell you, Mr. Speaker, for why. Because when we lose sight of that approach and make this a political football, as happened in the past, then we end up with the spectacle of a decent man, and he was a decent man, the previous Prime Minister, diminishing himself at this dispatch box by making trans jokes whilst the mother of a murdered trans teenager watched from the public gallery just up there. That will never be my approach. My approach will be to support the ruling, to protect single-sex spaces and treat everybody with dignity and respect. And I believe there's a consensus in this House and the country for that approach.
Mr. Speaker, there is no apology for the member for Canterbury. There is no taking of responsibility. He talks about political football. He practically kicked her out of his party. Constructive dismissal. Constructive dismissal. He talks about my predecessor. What about the abuse I faced from his MPs calling me a transphobe for supporting what the Supreme Court has now clarified in his words. And where was he? He hid for 6 days without commenting on the Supreme Court judgment. Why did it take him so long to respond? Isn't it because he was scared?
Yes. Of course, Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the only fiction here is the idea she delivered anything in office. Yes. She held the post of Minister for Women and Equalities for 2 years, and she did precisely nothing. She provided no clarity on the law, did nothing to improve women's lives, which got materially worse under her watch. They talk, for example, about hospitals and mixed-sex wards, uphill and downdale. What happened in the last decade? The use of mixed-sex wards in our NHS rose by 2,000%. And there's a pattern of behaviour here. Women and Equalities Minister failed to do anything for women. The Trade Minister, who failed to get a trade deal with the US. The Business Minister, who failed to get a deal with British Steel. She's a spectator, not a leader.
Mr. Speaker, I will tell him what I did. I stopped the gender... I will. Yes. When his Labour leader in Scotland was whipping his MSPs to get male rapists into women's prisons, I stopped that gender recognition bill. I helped commission the Cass review. I replaced the guidance on single-sex toilets. I made sure that the puberty blockers issue was resolved while he was sitting there cheering on the ideology that was taking away safe spaces. And when the Prime Minister stayed silent last week, presumably waiting for what Morgan McSweeney thinks, on his WhatsApp groups, some of his closest ministers were plotting to overturn the Supreme Court decision. Labour MP after Labour MP stood up yesterday and challenged the ruling. How can we take his government seriously on this?
Well, I think the WhatsApp group you should be worried about is the one of his shadow Justice Secretary. And Mr. Speaker, the mask has slipped just 1 week before the elections because the shadow Justice Secretary is not here. A man who's doing everything he can to replace her. The man that most of them want as leader of their party has admitted that Reform and the Tories are working together. He said, I want this fight to be united. He said he's determined to bring this coalition, he calls it, together one way or another. Well, I think we know what that means. Every Tory voter is appalled at the thought of paying for the NHS. Every Reform voter who hates what the Tories did the last 14 years, they're not Conservatives, they're a con.
Who's playing political football now? He's got no answers, Mr. Speaker. He's got no answers. Yesterday, Labour MP after Labour MP challenged the ruling. He should be more worried about his backbenchers than my frontbenchers. His Labour ministers called the chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission appalling. Baroness Faulkner's role is critical to enforcing the court's judgment. She has had to put up with relentless abuse, not just from his front bench, but from activists and ideologues. Reappointing her will be a clear sign that he is taking this issue seriously. So will he commit to reappointing Baroness Faulkner when her term expires this year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've always said the debate should be conducted properly on the principles of debate. I've said it many, many times. But I would remind the Leader of the Opposition that when they were in government, violence against women and girls reached record highs, rape prosecutions fell to record lows, and millions of women were left stuck on NHS waiting lists, unable to get the health care that they needed. Under this Labour government, NHS waiting lists down by more than 200,000, domestic abuse specialists in 999 control rooms. We've strengthened access to maternity pay, something she calls excessive. She talks about political footballs, but a coalition between Reform and the Tories being formed behind her back, we know what that means when the Shadow Justice Secretary and the member for Clacton cook up their joint manifesto. NHS charging a pro-Russia foreign policy, end to workers' rights. Just as the Love government lost control of the economy, the borders and health, in 6 short months, she's lost control of her party.
Mr. Speaker, he's clearly so uncomfortable talking about this subject. Yes. This is a choice between a Conservative Party that stood up for common sense and a Labour Party that bent the knee to every passing fad. This is a question about moral courage, Mr. Speaker, about doing the right thing even when it is difficult. And the truth is, he doesn't have the balls. The Prime Minister only tells people what they want to hear. He only tells people what they want to hear. He is a weather vane who twists in the wind. He cheered an ideology that denied safe spaces to women and girls because he thought it was cool to do so. He hounded a brave female MP out of his party for telling the truth he accepts now. And now he is hiding behind the Supreme Court judgment. And isn't that because he doesn't know what he actually believes?
I can only assume that sounded better when she did it in the mirror earlier on. But the truth is, it doesn't really matter what the Leader of the Opposition says, because nobody believes, none of them, that she's going to lead them into the next election anyway. It's going to be the shadow justice. He's away plotting. That's why he's not here today, Mr. Speaker. And the member for Clacton fighting over the bones of the Tory party. And they think Reform are going to give them their votes without changing their policy. Absolutely no way. The member for Clacton's going to do what he always does, eat the Tory party for breakfast.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I wish you and the House a happy St George's Day as well. I recently had the pleasure to visit the National Gas Operations in Peterborough, where the company was announcing a £350 million investment in the UK, including 100 new jobs at least in my constituency. This investment will make Peterborough the centre of the nation's core gas and hydrogen network. But one of the big challenges that infrastructure projects like this face is the lack of available skills and training for young people. So can I ask the Prime Minister what more he can do to boost apprenticeships in places like mine and ensure we create the opportunities this country so desperately needs?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend? The net zero transition is a huge economic opportunity for this country, despite the naysayers on the opposition benches. And we've had almost £44 billion of investment since July, and that will deliver jobs across the country, including in his constituency. Investment, presumably, they don't want. We're ensuring we've got skilled workers that we need, launching the Skills England and our new growth and skills offer to encourage even more apprenticeships, and supporting industry-led plan for hydrogen to deliver the workforce needed for the industry of the future.
Shred David, Leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also wish the House and the country a happy St George's Day? And can I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the late Pope Francis? As a Christian myself, I found his compassion absolutely inspiring, and my prayers are with Catholics in the UK and across the world who will feel his loss particularly deeply. Mr. Speaker, I've raised with the Prime Minister before the issue of North Devon District Hospital. The last government promised to rebuild it, as they did hospitals across the southwest in places like Torbay and Musgrove Park. Unfortunately, they broke that promise, leaving appalling conditions like sewage leaks and patients being treated in corridors. So will the Prime Minister reconsider his decision to further delay the construction of new hospitals and ask his MPs to vote for our motion today for new hospitals?
Mr. Speaker, the previous programme of the party opposite was undeliverable and unaffordable, as I think he knows and accepts. We put the new hospital programme on a sustainable footing with a timeline that can be met. We're not prepared to trade on false promises as they did. And obviously we put record investment into the NHS. But I do just gently urge him to one day get a bit more serious about the funding of these measures, because every week he comes here to basically push me on two issues: to spend a lot more money, but at the same time in the next breath opposing the measures in the budget to raise the money that's necessary.
Sir Ed Davey.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the Prime Minister, we had a funded programme at the election. And I'm disappointed with his reply, and I hope he'll actually visit some of these hospitals to see the urgent need for rebuilding. Mr. Speaker, at Merton Mead Farm in Oxfordshire last week, I saw world-class British beef farmers at work. Farmers want him to be careful in any trade deal with President Trump. They were let down by the Conservatives' appalling trade deals and worried that a bad US deal could see American agribusiness undercut them with inferior meat. So will the Prime Minister guarantee a vote in this House on any trade deal that he agrees with the United States?
Yeah. Well, he raises a really important point of real interest and importance to farmers. We will negotiate, as he would expect, in the national interest and uphold the highest animal welfare standards. We are making progress on that, and then there'll be a process if a deal is reached.
Catherine Atkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This time last year, train manufacturing at Alstom in Derby was grinding to a halt. On a single day, workers with a combined welding experience of nearly 1,000 years walked out of its doors. But the whole city came together with crucial backing from this Prime Minister. And what a difference a year makes. With Alstom saved and set to host the greatest gathering to celebrate 200 years of rail and our railways coming back into public ownership with the headquarters of Great British Railways in Derby, will the Prime Minister agree that with Labour we are back on track?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, she's a fantastic champion for Derby. She's right, whether it's the workforce I met at Alstom or the workers at Hitachi in County Durham, we will support our rail industry, providing certainty that delivers jobs, investment and security for them. I met these workforces. I know how worried they were a year ago, she rightly says, when this government was in charge. I'm really proud that Derby will be the home of Great British Railways, because we're bringing railways back into public ownership, delivering better services for passengers, cutting delays and cancellations and boosting growth across the country.
Robin Swall.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister and my party in regards to the condolences to the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is often referred to his time working in Northern Ireland, and I've spoken to one of his bosses who speaks of his diligence. I wonder in that vein, could he speak to his Northern Ireland team about their understanding of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement? Because the Secretary of State in an interview seemed to think that it had been negotiated by Ian Paisley rather than David Trimble and my party. His Northern Ireland Minister has said at the start of this week that the future of Northern Ireland as part of the Union is dependent on opinion polls, and she wasn't sure if she was a Unionist. Can the Prime Minister confirm to me his understanding of the principle of consent and confirm to this House that he is a Unionist?
Well, I thank him for that question, and I did work in Northern Ireland for 5 years and therefore appreciate firsthand how important these issues are. And it was a very formative period for me in terms of my career and my thinking. The Good Friday Agreement is one of the proudest achievements of the last Labour government. I pay tribute to everybody who helped bring that around, because, as he will know and other members will know, it was such an important moment in the history of the conflict, and I absolutely stand full square behind the principles, some of which I was doing my part to help implement when I was working in Northern Ireland. They will always drive me on the issues that he raises with me.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you. Happy St George's Day, Mr. Speaker, and may I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks about Pope Francis. Mr. Speaker, after 14 years of Conservative government, too many of my Middlesbrough and Thornbury East constituents live on low incomes or in real poverty. I very much welcome the employment support proposals in the Welfare Green Paper, but the government has to be clear about the real opportunities it's offering more than 3 million families who it says will lose out financially as a result of this package. So before asking MPs to vote, can he confirm that we will see fresh OBR analysis, evidence on who will be affected by the PIP changes, and the government's own assessment of the employment impact of its measures? And will he confirm that this policy will not result in increased experience of poverty?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are reforming a broken system, the system that we inherited, and I think most people accept that it needs reform because it traps people in unemployment and inactivity, and we need to reform it for that reason. The principles will be that we will provide support where support is needed. Where people do want to get into work, we will help them into work. The current system operates against people getting into work who want to make that transition, and that if you can work, you should work. Moving into work is what halves your risk of being in poverty, and that's why we've invested £1 billion in tailored employment support. And of course, we're introducing a new premium for those with the most severe lifelong disabilities who will never be able to work.
Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Lefarydd. Last week, former steelworkers in Port Talbot watched in dismay as this government deemed their livelihoods worth less than those in Scunthorpe. FOIs reveal that the UK government doesn't know how its funding for reskilling workers in Wales is being used, or even how many people are being retrained. We know concerns have been raised by the Transition Board. If this government can't explain how it's helping Port Talbot's laid-off workers to build a future through reskilling, why shouldn't those workers then come to the logical conclusion that Labour has abandoned them?
She raised a really important issue in relation to Port Talbot. I've visited a number of times and heard firsthand from the workforce there. And she may or may not know that even in opposition before the election, I was talking to the owners to try to persuade them to delay their decisions because I knew an election was coming. That's how important I thought it was. I would remind her that at the same time, the then Prime Minister refused to pick up a call to the First Minister to even discuss the issue. I took a different approach because I realised just how important it was. I would remind her, because she compares it with the decisions we took last week, that the blast furnaces were turned off in January of last year, the coke ovens in March 2024, and therefore that was before the election. That was the very thing I was trying to ensure didn't happen for reasons that she and the workforce will understand, and I was talking to the workforce throughout that. What we've been able to do there, since then is to negotiate an improved deal with Tata. We did that within 10 weeks. Better terms for the workers. And we're working hard to maximise opportunities from the £1.25 billion investment in electric arc furnace and supporting those with job losses with £80 million of funding to learn new skills, supply chains and protect communities. But I mean, she talks about protecting working people, but she voted against the biggest settlement, devolution settlement, since devolution. That includes more money for public services, including the NHS, and they voted against it.
Can I commend the Prime Minister and his government for the action taken so far to reform the NHS in England, making it fit for the modern day, with improved technology, more GPs and appointments, and waiting lists cut for consecutive months. However, it is deeply unfortunate that in Scotland we have an SNP government that has made the political choice to waste taxpayers' money on vanity projects, flawed legislation and failed court cases rather than focus on improving our health service. Does he agree with me that the people of Airdrie and Shotts, who have been promised a new hospital for almost a decade, deserve far better than suffering and pain on waiting lists and receiving treatment in crumbling buildings as a direct consequence of SNP incompetence?
My honourable friend is a real champion for Airdrie and Shotts. And over 60,000 Scots have been stuck waiting for tests or treatments for over a year. That's a 46% rise in 1 year. And yet almost 50,000 fewer operations have been carried out compared with before the pandemic. And compare what the SNP are doing with what we're doing here in England. We've driven down waiting lists within 6 months, 6 months' worth of reductions in a row with over 3 million extra appointments. Scotland's NHS urgently needs change, but the SNP has no strategy, no plan and absolutely no ideas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The danger posed by China to our national security is self-evident. So can the Prime Minister explain why he and his government have chosen to treat Beijing as a business partner and not as the hostile state that it truly is?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've set out our approach to China a number of times. It's not materially different to the approach of the last government in the last years of the last government, I might just add. And in relation to Scunthorpe, of course, the deal that we had to deal with during recess was the deal negotiated by the last government. We've taken sensible decisions in the national interest and will continue to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Prime Minister will join me in celebrating the opening of the new Brixton Blood Donation Centre in my constituency, which in 3 months has seen over 3,700 people donate, over 1,000 of them first-timers and 10% of them black. However, with sickle cell anemia, the fastest growing genetic condition in the UK, this is not enough. Demand for the RO blood subtype, more common in people of African descent, is rising 10 to 15% annually and is crucial for treating sickle cell. Rules around travel as well as inaccurate iron tests are seeing willing black donors turned away for 4 to 12 months. Of course, blood donation must be safe, but failure to review these guidelines is costing lives. So will the Prime Minister commit to reviewing these rules and join me in calling on you, Mr. Speaker, to help us all play our part by facilitating a biannual blood drive in Parliament?
Well, I'll leave that to you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's for me to suggest that you donate your blood. Well, I'm sure you do, and we can support this jointly. And actually, across the House, we should take that up under your leadership, Mr. Speaker. But let me join her in welcoming the new Brixton Blood Donor Centre and the life-saving support that it provides. Increasing donor diversity is a priority for the NHS. And we're working to increase row blood donations by engaging with communities who are more likely to have this blood type. And I'll make sure that she meets the relevant health minister to discuss what more we can do in this area.
Sir David Davis.
British governments of all political persuasions have long taken pride in reducing the carbon footprint of British manufacturing industry. Unfortunately, in too many cases, and too much of it, of this so-called reduction has been achieved by driving British industry abroad to other countries, like China and India, that actually use more carbon to produce the same product. British steel is just the latest of this, which is bad for the global environment and also disastrous for the British economy. And this is against a background of European carbon policies that have failed over 20 years. So does the Prime Minister have a new domestic British policy which will protect British industry from this long-term disastrous trend?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, we are doing everything available to us to protect car building in this country, and he will have noticed that 2 weeks ago I made announcements about the Z mandate and what more we could do to support the industry at the moment. That was an immediate response to circumstances as they were, but I indicated at the time, and I do so again, that we will do whatever it takes to support our car industry.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Billy spent months trying to see a GP to investigate his symptoms. It took 4 months of telephone appointments before we finally got seen in person and actually got the tests that diagnosed stage 4 cancer. A delay in diagnosis, which has dramatically changed his prognosis. And as someone who's become a friend, it hurts me to see the pain he is now living in. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that primary care is a vital part of the healthcare system and we need wider access to both in-person appointments and to telephone ones?
Well, I'm deeply sorry to hear about Billy's case, and I'm sure the whole House is. And our focus has to be on making sure GPs spend more time caring for patients. And that includes the investment of an additional £889 million into general practice in England, putting over 1,500 GPs into surgeries since October. We did deliver a record settlement for Scotland's public services to help fix our NHS and ensure people like Billy get the care that they deserve.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through the ages, an innovative and vibrant City of London has underpinned investment and growth in the wider economy. But the main challenge the city currently faces is how to get more capital into capital markets. Now, I believe, and many believe, that London can gain new momentum if the government takes bold action to challenge and empower those who steward our pension assets to do things in new ways. So I ask the Prime Minister,
Following the decision of the Chancellor to offer continuity of leadership at the FCA, will he convene an urgent number 10 summit with city leaders and the regulators to reset and to maximise the chances that the city can lead economic growth and recovery in these times of grave uncertainty and turmoil?
He's right that we need to go further and faster in terms of kick-starting growth, attracting the investment that we need to create jobs, and our regulators must regulate for growth and not just for risk. And we do want that continuity of leadership that he mentions, and we are convening and getting people together to drive that growth, and we'll take away the ideas that he puts on the table.
Alison Hoon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proposed changes to personal independence payments mean that people who require various levels of support due to lifelong conditions such as learning disabilities will not meet the new eligibility criteria. However, the Green Paper introduces a group of people with lifelong conditions who will not be subject to reassessment. Can the Prime Minister confirm that people with a learning disability, which is a lifelong condition that will not change, will be included in the group of claimants who will not be subjected to repeated reassessments?
Well, thank her for her question. I know this means a lot to her. We're clear on the principles for reform, protecting those with the most severe disabilities who will never be able to work, as she references, and making sure people with the most severe disabilities and health conditions will never face the prospect of being constantly reassessed again. We are making sure that extra financial support is based on the impact of health condition or disability, not the capacity to work, and I can reassure her we're carefully considering options for transitional protection.
Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. His Chancellor's economic policies started off badly and have headed rapidly downhill from there. His Energy Secretary's policies ensure that energy-rich Scotland lives under the highest domestic and commercial energy prices in the world, and his Foreign Secretary provides diplomatic cover for the atrocities committed in Gaza by the IDF, to the horror of the people of Scotland. This is just one, but he is the incompetent-in-chief who refuses to bring his ministers into line. Just one of the reasons that independence enjoys an 11-point lead over remaining in this dysfunctional, broken Brexit Britain. Does he understand why the people of Scotland are so dissatisfied with the latest iteration of dysfunctional British rule in Scotland?
Does he understand the electorate in Scotland answered that question in July of last year? I remember there used to be quite a few of them sitting around here. Now it's a distant cry from up there.
Final questions, Sultan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, humanitarian law organisations applied for an arrest warrant for Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar over alleged war crimes in Gaza, including the siege of Kamal Adwan Hospital and the torture of its director, Dr. Hussam Abu Safir. Yet the red carpet was rolled out. Saar has justified blocking vital humanitarian aid into Gaza, backed the illegal annexation of Palestinian land, and rejected a Palestinian state. The Prime Minister is a human rights lawyer, so surely he knows that the UK has a legal duty to uphold international law. Why then did he block the arrest of an unindicted war criminal?
I didn't.
Right, that completes Prime Minister's questions.
That was an abrupt end there to Prime Minister's questions for this week. Let me welcome our guests for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, and for the Opposition, for the Conservatives, the Shadow Health Secretary, Ed Arger. And for the BBC, the Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young. Welcome to all of you. Well, it was a strong performance by Kemi Badenoch. It started, actually, with the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats wishing the House a happy St George's Day, before Kemi Badenoch really got stuck into questioning Keir Starmer on whether he changed his mind on who is a woman. This following the Supreme Court's ruling that a woman is legally defined by biological sex. She used rather colourful, strident language to say he was a weather-vane politician. He didn't know what to think on this issue, and he didn't have the balls to come clean on his personal views. What did you make of it, Vicky?
Well, it's interesting because Kemi Badenoch yesterday, when this was a statement in the House of Commons, chose to come and do the response. So it's clearly an issue where I think she feels vindicated. Now, she has talked about not having too many policies in the Conservative Party at the moment. This is one where she does have a policy, and you can sort of see her confidence in this issue. And also she is helped by the fact that, to put it kindly, Keir Starmer's been on a bit of a journey when it comes to this issue. If you think back to some of the clips of him being asked questions about whether it's transphobic to say that women have a cervix, for example, are trans women women? He said all of those things, and then in 2019, having backed self-identification, for example, then in 2023, before the election, did shift the party on all of this, but has sort of avoided really answering those questions. I mean, yesterday, his official spokesman, when he was asked, does he still believe that trans women are women? He said, no, the Supreme Court has said when looking at the Equality Act that a woman is a biological woman. So this Supreme Court ruling, in some ways, I think helps Keir Starmer because he can now talk about that, saying the judgment's been made, there's clarity now, and he can talk about, dialing down the toxicity of this debate. He can talk about treating people with dignity. But there still does have to be some policy ramifications for this. And I think that is what, including Lisa Nandy, people are going to have to deal with in government.
Well, we're going to explore some of those in just a moment. But first of all, let's go back to that journey when it comes to this issue, Lisa Nandy, because Kemi Badenoch accused the Prime Minister of hiding behind this Supreme Court ruling. I mean, in 2022, Sir Keir Starmer told The Times that trans women are women. Yesterday, his spokesperson said, no, the Prime Minister says a woman is a biological woman. Do you accept he has fundamentally changed his mind? I can just show you here. A woman, he said in 2022 that a woman is a female adult.
So I don't accept for a moment that what he's done is change the approach and position that he set out at PMQs today. He said at PMQs that we need to take the heat out of this debate. We need far more light, far less heat. We need to treat people, all people, with respect and dignity, particularly trans people who in recent years have become the butt of political jokes. They've been attacked and discriminated against. And we also need to be absolutely uncompromising when it comes to safety. Where my approach has evolved is that my understanding of the law until this ruling was that it made provision for people who'd been through a gender recognition process and transitioned to a different gender to be recognised in that gender in legal terms. Now, the Supreme Court has ruled that is not the case. I think the Scottish Government was in a similar position. Many people had interpreted the law as such. We now have the clarity that we need, but what the Supreme Court hasn't done is then determine what policy follows. And as Vicki said, that's what we're working through.
Why did it take a Supreme Court ruling to tell the Labour Party, the government and the Prime Minister who is a woman?
Well, it didn't at all.
It has, because in 2022, we can show you here, Keir Starmer, a woman is a female adult, and in addition to that, trans women are women. And that is not just my view, that is actually the law. That is the complete opposite of what he is saying now. That's no longer his view, is it?
Look, we're all perfectly capable of understanding what a woman is. The question is that the Supreme Court was deciding is how is woman and man defined in law? Yeah. And many people, including the Scottish Government and including many others, thought that the law made provision for people who've been through a gender recognition process, according to the terms of the law, to be recognised in that gender once they've transitioned. It doesn't. The Supreme Court has ruled. And that has profound implications for the way that services are provided.
So was the Prime Minister wrong? Were you wrong in the past by saying trans women are women?
Look, I misunderstood the application of the law, like many people, and that's what we're working through now. That's why we have strongly welcomed the legal clarity that the Supreme Court provides.
Because it's been pointed out by the Supreme Court. We can say what you said also in 2022. I think trans women are women. I think trans men are men. So I think they should be choosing where they're accommodated in a prison. Do you still think that?
Well, that is a partial quote, Jo, and can I just... I think this is a really good example of where this debate needs to come to rise to this moment. We've got two groups of people, as the Supreme Court judgment recognised. We've got women who historically have been discriminated against on the grounds of their sex. That is how the law has evolved in order to protect them. We've also got a group of people, trans people, who, as the Supreme Court recognised, are amongst the most marginalised and discriminated against in the country, and Parliament has rightly taken steps to protect them as well. What this Supreme Court ruling says is not that you don't recognise the rights and the dignity of trans people. No. It says that
in the eyes of the law is what they have stated. And Keir Starmer said something completely different back in 2022.
No, he didn't. He was recognising that when people have been through the gender recognition process and transitioned to a different gender, that they can be recognised as that gender. What this ruling says is that the provision of services is based on biology. Now that we've got that ruling, that has big implications for the way that we provide services. It has big implications in my brief in particular,
yes,
around sports and other things.
All right.
And we're working very closely with the relevant bodies, including all of the sporting bodies, to make sure that we get that right. Biology has always mattered, especially in sport. That's always been a long-standing principle that has been recognised. But we need to additionally find ways to enable trans people to participate in sport.
Ed Ogg, do you accept
that just seems to me
that?
a sensible and pragmatic approach to what has become a very heated issue that has started to erase the human beings that are at the centre of this debate.
Ed?
So there's a couple of things, Jo. Firstly, I would say I think Lisa is typically measured in what she says. I've been on your programme with her before, and she is always reasonable and measured in the approach she takes. To the broader point, though, that you're raising about the Prime Minister and his position on this issue, I think what you do see is a genuine difference in confidence and in approach. Kemi Badenoch, Leader of the Opposition, took, as Vicki said, took that debate yesterday, which wouldn't be normal for a Leader of the Opposition, but clearly knew exactly what she wanted to say and where she stood on this, because this is an issue she's been very, very clear on for many, many years. And I do think it is fair to say that the Prime Minister has, I think you put it gently by saying, been on a journey. I think he's moved his position considerably on this issue. I think Kemi was always very clear in her view.
Can I ask you a question? This is a genuine question, right? So one of the things that, when we talk about the prisons debate, for example, that is really tricky to work through is that what this ruling says is that if you are a biological woman, you're accommodated in a women's prison, biological man in a man's prison. Now, that obviously means that trans people who've been through a trans process and are trans women will be in a men's prison. But it also means that people who've been through that process and are trans men will be in a women's prison. Now, that presents all sorts of safety implications for people in women's prisons.
Well,
has Kemi really thought that through? And do you have a policy on how to deal with that?
Those implications were addressed very clearly way back in 2022 by Brandon Lewis in his admittedly brief period as Lord Chancellor under Liz Truss. But he set out very clearly back then, ahead of this judgment, a very clear policy to address exactly that. And even before then, the prison service had a very clear policy that was where someone presented a risk to, for example, someone who was biologically male, a risk to females by the nature of their crime and things, would not be accommodated in women's prison. That didn't happen. They were accommodated in different parts.
The difficulty with that is there isn't any capacity at the moment because of the mess you left.
But hang on, what is going to happen?
I mean, these are the practical issues that, as a government, we are having to work through at the moment.
Well, there's 2 points
and I didn't hear anything from Kemi about that at
There's
PMQs.
2 points, I think, here, Lisa. One is the broader point, which we're addressing, is has the Prime Minister been on a journey? Politely, I would say, has been. Slightly less politely, I'd say he didn't know what he thought to start with. Kemi Badenoch did. But you are right to highlight that there is now a big question as to what the practical implications of this ruling are. Yeah. 88 pages, I know you've read it all the way through, I have as well. It is actually, for a legal ruling, it's pretty clear. I've read a number of them over the years. I think it's actually a very, I may say, well-written, clear judgment.
Not want to change?
What I think we need to do, and she's been very clear, that biological sex should, therefore, she's always been clear about this, even before this ruling, should be the determinant, and single-sex spaces should be determined by biological sex. Now, I think there's a real challenge for the government to move quickly here, and I know that Lisa said...
To do what?
Hang on. And I know that Lisa's said they intend to bring forward guidance to the Human Rights Commission and others, but I think they need to move very, very fast, because to take the NHS, how do they intend to deal in their constitution, which Vicki Atkins was working to change just before the election in this respect? How do they get that guidance in place very quickly to make sure what this ruling said?
Right, all right, well, let's pick it up on
reflected in
prisons,
wards?
because you said then that trans women and trans men should be accommodated in a prison of their choosing. Is that now different? Is that now going to change because of this ruling?
Well, the position I set out when I was asked that question in 2019 was precisely the position that Ed was just outlining, that the Conservative government came to, which is that safety is your overriding consideration.
So where will trans women and trans men be housed if they go to jail?
Well, this is the question that I was posing to Ed. The law is clear, and the ruling is clear that the law says that services are provided on the basis of biology. So if you are a trans woman, you'll be in a men's prison, and if you are a trans man, you will be in a woman's prison. Now that
and
does
are you happy with that? Trans people?
It's not just for trans people, it's also for women in women's prisons, where you've got somebody who has been through the gender transition process.
And are you comfortable with that?
This is the point that I was making to Ed, is that what we now have to do as a government, with all of the relevant bodies and authorities, is make sure that we provide essentially what is a third category of accommodation, which is safe for everybody. Now, that is a real challenge, because we were left prisons that were 99%
So what are you going to do in the meantime?
So we're working on this right now, and Ed says that we delayed. Actually, we didn't delay, because we stood on a manifesto, as you know, where we said that safe spaces mattered and that the Labour government would protect them on the basis of biology. So actually, I'm still not clear what Kemi Badenoch's disagreement with Keir Starmer is. And both of us have acknowledged that we now need to move at pace in order to implement this in a way that is fair and safe.
There would have to be a third choice.
Well, look, the prison service, and I was prisons minister for a brief period, but is very experienced at managing risk, making sure, be it terrorism risk, be it a whole range of other things. So this ruling is very clear that biological sex is what matters. I do not think it is beyond the capacity of the prison service to manage safely transgender prisoners in a prison on the basis of their biological sex.
I don't think
that is doable.
OK, I mean, you don't have, again, a policy, or the Conservatives don't yet have a policy, apart from criticising Keir Starmer for having changed his mind or not knowing what he actually thinks about this. When it comes to sport, which is your area, Lisa, should trans women now, on the basis of this ruling, be excluded from all women's sports?
Well, look, first of all, it's not for the government doesn't determine how sporting bodies govern their own sports.
Well, hang on, you've got the Equality Act, which is very clear. If this is the definition through the law, there's no discretion.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to answer the question genuinely, because I think this is something that was a big priority for me when I first was appointed 9 months ago. I've heard loud and clear from female athletes real concerns about the way that some of these codes of conduct and governance have evolved, which mean that for generations of female athletes, because of the differences in biology, they're shut out from being able to perform and win at elite levels. Now, what we've been doing is working proactively with the sporting bodies in order to find a way to acknowledge, first of all, that biology matters. It just does in sport. That's why we have different weight categories. It's why we have different categories in the Paralympics.
But if you as the government aren't going
to,
don't think you can intervene, what's happened is that different sporting authorities have taken a different approach, haven't they?
We can certainly get involved. There is no question at all. We have been proactive about this already.
Excluded trans women, you think now will?
Well, look, the point is this. Biology matters, and we've been working with them to make sure that we have codes that are fair and that are safe. But we also need to find ways simultaneously to allow trans people to participate in sports. Well, it's good for your health, it's good for your mental health. This isn't just about what happens at elite sport, this is about what happens at grassroots.
All right, but let's have a look at the elite sport with Ed Arger again.
Who want to play grassroots football or other sports.
Yeah, sure.
We need to make sure that they're included as well, but in a way that is safe and is fair. That's what we've been doing.
Do you think if you were in government, you would be saying to sports authorities, trans women cannot take part in women's sport at an elite level?
Well, as you and journalistic colleagues gently remind us, we are only just out of government.
So you're hiding behind the fact that you're in opposition. But the point I would make, no, because I want to come back to the point you made earlier, you're saying, what would our policy be? Kemi's been very clear that biological sex is what matters, and that should determine where someone goes in prison, how a hospital operates, and indeed how sport operates. Lisa's absolutely right to say that the government isn't the governing body for sport.
because they have their own governing bodies. But we are very clear that this ruling confirms something that I think Kemi's been very clear about for many years, which is biological sex matters, and it should not be beyond the government. Now we've got total legal clarity with this ruling, these 88 pages, to get on with publishing that guidance and making sure that every organisation knows what it needs to do.
Yes, but you said you're going to get involved, Lisa, and as
I've
Secretary of State for Sport,
what
what is your view? What would your direction be in those meetings about what happens at elite levels?
First of all, if I start directing what happens at elite levels, we could easily fall foul of international rules and not be able to compete in international competitions. So there's a reason why governments do not interfere in the governance of sports, and that is a matter for sporting bodies. But my view is this, that biology matters. It does matter in sport. That is a long-established principle. As I was saying to Vicki, it's why you have different weight categories in certain sports like boxing and others. It's why you have different categories in the Paralympics.
I understand.
And
Can I put it another way?
Can you,
as Vicki was saying, can you have sports authorities doing different things?
Yes.
Does everyone have to do the same thing? Does there have to be consistency now we've had this ruling?
Yeah, I think you can. Let me try and give you an example of this. And, I'm not telling these sporting bodies what to do. But when I went to the Paralympics over the summer, the way that they run their wheelchair basketball, the rules are that you select a team. Individuals in the team are awarded different points based on their level of disability. You can field a team that is of very different abilities and disabilities as long as the teams are evenly balanced. And that means that you can include a range of people in the same sport. Now, when it comes to running, for example, to athletics, it's a different case. And so that's why sports have to approach this on a case-by-case basis. Right. They want to be inclusive, but biology matters, and that's a principle that we've always accepted, I've always accepted, and we're keen to find a practical way through this.
All right, but you would be happy, in principle, and in some instances, for sports authorities to say, actually, we will let trans men and women compete in sports that they choose and in their preferred gender?
Well, it depends on the context, because if that is not safe or fair, then no is the answer. But
right.
So it depends very much on the context.
But there would be circumstances where you would agree to it if it was sort of outlined.
If it was safe and fair. But the question is, what are those circumstances?
All right, we're going to talk about something else. This headline in The Guardian, the Shadow Justice Secretary, raised actually by Keir Starmer in terms of divisions within the Conservatives. Robert Jenrick vows to bring coalition together to prevent Tory reform fight. Shadow Justice Secretary says he wants parties to avoid competing against each other at next election. Is that a good idea?
Kemi Badenoch's been very clear that there will be no pact. She is fighting hard to win for every Conservative at the next election, but also, crucially at the moment, in my own constituency, for example, we've got local elections. My councillors are working flat out to get Conservatives elected. That's what we're doing. We're focused on getting Conservatives elected, not on any sort of pacts, or indeed, and I've been around a little while in politics. I'm always cautious about sources say or reports of this or reports of that and what happens.
It was recorded. And I say Robert Jenrick.
Sources. I also saw at the bottom that sources deny it. So I'd be cautious about commenting on anything like that. But Kemi is the leader of our party, and she's been very clear. She's not in the business of doing electoral pacts. She's in the business of getting Conservatives elected because they do a good job.
Right. Has Robert Jenrick spoken out of turn then? I mean, he's on the front bench. He's serving as Shadow Justice Secretary, and he is calling for a collaboration, a pact with reform.
I think what Rob is doing a fantastic job as Shadow Justice Secretary on the front bench, taking the arguments...
But not so good at advice at electoral pacts.
Taking the arguments to the government, holding them to account. Just this week, yesterday, we saw the Lord Chancellor bring forward legislation around sentencing guidelines.
All right.
That's pretty much down to Rob's hard work on this.
Yeah, but what about on this? Should he be disciplined?
So I think what Rob is doing here is he's making a very clear point that there is a range of opinion on the right of British politics that can coalesce, I think, around what Kemi is putting forward and what my party is putting forward. There will be people who vote Conservative, there will be people who are thinking of voting reform. I think those people, if they look at what Kemi is offering as leader of the opposition, will see it's, in many cases, pretty close to their views. So
or he doesn't think Kemi Badenoch's doing a very good job and he should be leader and this will help.
I sit in Shadow Cabinet with both of them. Rob Jenrick is working flat out to help make Kemi Badenoch Prime Minister at the next general election. You will have seen the work he's doing as Shadow Justice Secretary.
Yes,
that is all about highlighting the failures of this government and our alternative
He's reminding his
approach.
colleagues that he's there just in case.
Rob Jenrick is a hard-working Shadow Secretary of State. He's working very, very hard to promote my party, our party, hold the government to account, and to help make Kemi Badenoch Prime Minister at the next general election. I've known him many, many years, and I know how hard he works, and I know how committed he is to the Conservative Party.
Right, it would show she's a strong leader if she disciplined him, though, wouldn't it?
We're all pulling in the same direction. I mean,
well, he's called for working with Reform, your rivals, because they are going to take, according to some of the surveys and polls, hundreds of seats from you at the local election.
Well, what I'm focused on, what my colleagues who are fighting council seats are focused on, what my colleagues in the Shadow Cabinet, including Rob, are focused on, is getting as many Conservatives elected on the 1st of May to county councils up and down this country as possible, and then to getting the Conservatives in government. I've been around a long time. Stories or media sources suggesting a row here and a row there.
Quite often true, aren't they?
Makes great coverage. But I'm afraid, Jo, and I have huge respect for your knowledge of politics and your time doing this, but often they're not true.
You filled very well, Ed Argo, in terms of trying to dispute any cause by Rob Jenrick for a pact with Reform. On that note, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much to my guests for joining me today. I'll be back with more Politics Live at 12:15 tomorrow here on BBC Two and the iPlayer from Oars. Good afternoon.